So psychology oftentimes gets bundled up with the other things that the average layperson doesn't really understand the purpose of and can get labeled outrageous research. I'm going to give you some examples of things that have recently, as of 2019, in the 2019 budget cycle, were labeled as outrageous research. So, for example, there was one study that was awarded $2 million from the federal government to study how to increase political trust in Tunisia. Now you can see that this has a little bit of a psychological twist to it, right? How do you increase trust in the political system in Tunisia? Now I put outrageous in quotation marks because I think it's sort of in the eye of the beholder, even with these short descriptions, whether this is an outrageous study or not, right? A lot of times with a short description, anything looks outrageous. I mean, if you truncate down the most important study on cancer treatments or something, it might look outrageous in a shortened little 10-word description. And a lot of times it looks outrageous not because the question was bad, but maybe because of how much money was awarded. That might be also why it gets labeled outrageous. But if we knew a little bit more about the study, we might be aware that, they're actually trying to figure out a way to stabilize Tunisia so that maybe it could become, sort of a center point in, North Africa for democracies and systems that work solidly so that, it could become a model for its neighbors for how to run a political system and a country in a stable way. Okay, well, that might be worth our while, right? But $2 million to study how to increase political trust, it's easy to look at that and say, well, that seems like a waste of money, right? Or $466,991. I had to give you guys the exact dollar amount because it's like, that's pretty specific, to study Panamanian frog mating calls. So they're trying to figure out ways to, figure out when frogs are trying to attract a mate, whether they're reproducing effectively. It was part of the study, whether, deforestation was having an impact on them or exposure to pesticides, things like that. So the short version, how does it cost $466,991 to study frog mating calls? That seems like something that you could answer with a lot less money. But when you realize the extent of what they were studying, you might say, well, it doesn't seem that outrageous to me. How about this one? $51 million to use Google to search climate hazards in Hawaii. Now I got to kind of unpack this short sentence here because what actually happened is they brought a bunch of people to Hawaii and then they all sat in one room with their laptops and they all searched Google for articles on climate hazards. And, $51 million does seem a little excessive for that task that could especially have been conducted from everybody's individual homes. They didn't need to go to Hawaii to have this happen, right? So a lot of times outrageous research has to do with the topic, has to do with the location, has to do with how much it cost. $10 million to study green growth in Peru. They were looking at in Peru, sort of the equivalent of the Green New Deal kind of idea. And so 10 million American dollars were dedicated to studying how Peru was, enacting climate conscious, endeavors. So I pulled some out of other fields just to kind of illustrate. It's not just us. It's not just psychology that gets called outrageous a lot. But the thing about psychology is a lot of times when you take the topics of our research and distill them down to like a one sentence description, they sound like just pure common sense, which we talked about also at the very beginning of the class. The idea that a lot of times people think that the stuff that we study in psychology is just common sense. And so, I could have told you that. I can't believe that our taxpayer dollars went to studying that question. And so I feel a little bit of sympathy for these studies that showed up on this 2019, it's called, what's it called? Waste Book, the 2019 Waste Book report. I feel kind of bad for them because I don't know what they did in their study, but I'm going to guess it was more than what these little one sentence descriptions said. And actually, if you go to the Wastebook website, they have a 1-page description of what was included in the research. And most of them are not as dumb as these little sentences sound. But, there's this general idea that psychological research is just common sense. So we shouldn't waste any money on it. When in fact, a lot of the things that we study in psychology, we discover that the stereotype or the expectation that we had been holding is refuted by the data. And that's important to find out, that if we're all walking around thinking that, people behave in a certain way, and the truth is that they behave in, I just did a study where the outcome came out exactly, it didn't come out non-significant and sort of ambiguous. It came out exactly the opposite as we had predicted, exactly the opposite of our prediction. That's really important information. And our prediction had been based on previous literature. Our subject sample was regular college students. There was no reason for it to come out opposite, except for that it came out opposite, right? And so it's got to be part of that literature that helps to inform our understanding of human behavior. And, bit by bit, brick by brick, hopefully we'll start to undermine people's pre-existing expectations and start to replace those with, actual information that's based on actual human behavior. And hopefully one day we'll stop being labeled outrageous research, hopefully. Now I pulled this out of my favorite place, Discover Magazine, and it was, I thought, a really good depiction of, what determines whether a study is, outrageous or not, really. So we have the vertical axis, which goes from, it's plausible down to it's implausible. So plausible means it's probably studyable, the question is probably answerable. Implausible, it's probably either what we would still call a mystery, or we may not have the tools available or something right now to study these questions. And then on the horizontal axis, we see, it helps you. So the results of these studies on the left are going to be ones that help individuals more than society, as opposed to on the right-hand side, those are going to be studies that, are designed to help the world. So we have, the plausible that help you, the implausible that help you, the plausible that helps the world, and the implausible that helps the world. I thought it'd be fun to kind of look at what Discover Magazine said about this. So they highlighted this one study that says the purpose is to investigate how interacting with infants alters unrelated adults' behavior. And it's a $50,000 grant in the context of, the frog mating study. This is, a lot less, isn't it? And what they're looking at is oxytocin, and whether it spikes when holding babies, and whether it makes us feel more caretaking and other kinds of things. They came to the conclusion that basically babies make us fall in love with them and make us want to take care of them. Kind of an interesting study. I was pleased to see that they were able to answer that question for such a nominal fee, $50,000, from the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love. Never heard of that institute, but I may start applying for funding from them, because what an interesting institute. Other things that they put in the same quadrant of plausible and helps you, how do brain chemicals like oxytocin and testosterone affect our financial decisions? Does belief in an afterlife predict work behavior? Do positive memories help Holocaust survivors stay alive? What is prayer and how do we engage in it? So these are all on the plausible side, like they're thinking it's probably measurable, but you'll notice, for example, the prayer question is getting closer to the cutoff line for the plausible to implausible side. Like that might be more difficult to study than, let's say, how do infants affect the brain chemistry of unrelated adults? Like that's very studyable. So different kinds of things that fall into that sort of, plausible helps you side. On the implausible, but it would help you side, we have the Immortality Project is the one that they're highlighting here. And it's a $5 million grant to study the effect of increasing lifespan. They're looking at the idea that if we one day were able to achieve if one day we were able to achieve immortality, would that actually be harmful to our sense of meaning in life? Like if life went on forever, would we be as careful with it, right? So kind of an interesting question. It was towards the dividing line between plausible and implausible. So this one, you can see why it probably got $5 million, as opposed to the one in the bottom right that says, is there a purpose to the universe? That's solidly in the implausible side. Like, how would you ever determine whether there's a purpose to the universe? Does faith healing work? We used that as an example earlier on in class. And so far the data is suggesting not, but it's a kind of an implausible question, because it's difficult to quantify whether the faith healing failed or the way it was implemented failed, or right. There's like all these things that you can't really control in that study. So it's on the implausible side. Does going to church help the mentally ill is closer to the dividing line, because that's something that, you can quantify whether they went to church or not. Now, it's not getting into whether, they are faithful or any of the other things. It's just asking about, do they go to church? And does that help them with their mental illness? So that's closer to the plausible line. All right, how about plausible, and then it helps the world? The one that they highlighted was the genetics of higher cognitive ability. And we have it's almost $1 million that was awarded to Robert Plomin to study the genome of people with extremely high IQs. And so they're looking to see whether, genes determine intelligence or not. And this is something that psychologists have been talking about for, 100 years, whether intelligence is something that's acquired from your environment or if it's something that you carry with you on your genes. And so this is looking at just specifically people with extremely high IQs and trying to look for markers on their genome that might account for their extremely high IQs. We've got on the plausible side over here, we've got, neuroscience of multitasking, like what is going on in your brain while you're trying to do two tasks at the same time, what motivates generosity, the neuroscience of creativity. You're going to notice on this plausible side, there's a lot of them that have to do with actual brain functioning or hormone levels, things like that, because those are very measurable, right? Why do soldiers commit war crimes, and should they be held responsible? So we see how it's getting closer to the implausible line, because it's sort of like, and should they be held responsible? We're moving into a question of morality that's a little harder to study, right? And then finally, what is the nature of forgiveness? It's solidly on that line. It's like, okay, we maybe could measure it, but I could also argue that there would be some components of forgiveness that might be difficult to study, to quantify and really measure. Our final quadrant is the implausible helps the world. The one that they're highlighting is searching for the power stations of intelligent extraterrestrials. And they were awarded $200,000. And what they're looking for is evidence of a satellite that might be, circling a planet somewhere else in the universe that could be a solar power station, right? Like if we've come up with the idea for solar power, maybe other intelligent civilizations have come up with that. And so maybe we could look for evidence of that. It's implausible because, there's a lot of things to look at in the universe, and the likelihood of actually spotting it is pretty small, but it's towards the plausibility line because of the, if it's out there and it makes sense that there would be other civilizations and things like that. So it seems plausible. It just seems really hard, right? And then we've got, what are the origins of the universe? Again, that's towards the plausibility line because theoretically, they should be able to figure it out. But it's on the implausible side because it's like, the attempts that they've made so far to figure it out have not, been productive. Down farther, closer to the purely implausible, how might we detect multiple universes or multiverses? Right. And they're trying to figure out how could we do it? That's we don't even know how we would measure it. So that's going to be closer to implausibility. Someday in the future, it might move into the completely plausible as, fresh eyes, new ideas, new technology makes that question completely answerable. So I wanted to show you guys this graphic in part because what looks stupid to one person might look completely meaningful to another person. And what looks doable to one person might look completely undoable to somebody else. And so going back to that sort of, outrageous research, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? And so if you think it's interesting research, suddenly it's worth the money. And if it seems like it's doable, suddenly it seems like it's worth the money. And so those are the things I wanted to kind of highlight on that. Now, I mentioned that one of the reasons why psychologists study paranormal things and actually do most of the research that we do is that we really would like psychology to be beneficial to mankind. From the very inception of the field, the goal of the American Psychological Association was to make sure that psychologists were helping the public, that we were taking the results of our findings and actually improving education, improving the workplace, improving the way people think, reducing stereotyping and all the things that we do in psychology. Our mindset is that we would like to be able to help the public at large. So the Association for Psychological Science has its own publication called the Psychological Science in the Public Interest. So they have taken it so seriously that they've devoted an entire journal to articles that are devoted to topics that they're trying to disseminate to the general population. One of the things I've noticed about APS journals is that they get cited a lot in Discover Magazine, in Scientific American Mind, they're Psychology Today. They're really trying to get the results of the research that they publish out in front of the public so that the public can benefit from the things that we find in psychology. APA doesn't have a journal that's directed at this topic, but they do have a directorate, a group of people who, basically a committee who are trying to send out press releases and other, make websites and other kinds of things to help disseminate information that would help the larger population. Right. So there are websites that are devoted to psychological disorders, recognizing them, treating them, those kinds of things, so that the average lay person can benefit from that. APA has just recently introduced something that I toyed with using for our class, but it's a better match to a more advanced research methods class. But they just developed a training class for research methods for students of psychology. And it took a lot of effort and time and things to make sure that everything was included. That I've gone through the course, and it's really an effort to get the process of psychological science in front of undergraduates in particular. And they really would love to target lower division undergraduates so that we get you thinking in the scientific way from the very beginning. And so both of our major membership groups are really focused on trying to make sure that the things that we discover in psychology are in general helping the public. We want them to know. We don't want it to be secret science just for scientists. We want it to be consumable by the average person. So in conclusion of this chapter, and really the entire class could probably be tied in with this, I tried to do that throughout these lectures on this chapter. I started off talking about how studying paranormal psychology might actually, taint psychology, make people think that we study all sorts of outrageous and pointless things, and that, if we get funding for our research, that it would be wasteful. You can imagine if people think we're basically parapsychologists, that we don't really deserve research money to study our questions. But I wanted to remind you that, of course, psychology mainly focuses on the plausible end of that research spectrum that the Discover magazine graphic illustrated. We tend to focus on those plausible research questions. We've always, ever since this field was founded, strived to do research that would benefit the public, that would be in the public interest. And so it may be in the long run that studying paranormal psychology is something that's in the public interest, because like I said, maybe we will be able to one day, inform the population that, these are the ways that, psychics make it seem like they're reading your mind, or other kinds of things. So ultimately, even the things that might taint us may come to be in the best interest of, the larger population in the long run. Well, that concludes this scintillating discussion on the scientific principles of psychology. I hope that you enjoyed this class. I hope you've enjoyed my lectures if you just stumbled on them on YouTube. And hopefully we're all thinking a little bit more scientifically as we go forward in the field of psychology or in just life in general. So take care, and thank you for listening.